They say that when you save a life, you risk losing your own. Elias knew the rules of the mountain better than anyone. Never open your door to the blizzard and never interfere with the laws of nature. But that night, as the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero, the scratching at his door wasn't just a sound. It was a choice between staying safe in his solitude or letting in a creature that could kill him, or perhaps save him from a frozen heart. The grandfather clock in the corner of the cabin ticked rhythmically, a sound that usually comforted Elias but tonight felt like a countdown. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was the only sound in the room, fighting a losing battle against the howling wind outside. Elias was 72 years old, and he felt every single year in his aching joints. He lived in the high country, nestled deep within the Canadian Rockies, miles away from the nearest paved road, and even further from anyone who knew his name. Since his wife, Martha, had passed away 4 winters ago, the silence of the cabin had become a physical weight. It sat on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. He was a retired clockmaker, a man who had spent his life fixing broken things, making gears mesh and springs coil perfectly. But grief was not a mechanism he could repair. There were no spare parts for a lonely heart. Outside, the storm of the decade was raging. The weatherman on his crackling ham radio had called it a historic event, a blizzard that would bury the mountains under 10 feet of snow. Elias didn't need a radio to tell him that. He could feel the cabin shuddering under the assault of the wind. The wooden beams groaned like an old ship at sea. Snow was piling up against the frosted windows, turning the world outside into a featureless void of white and gray. Elias sat in his worn leather armchair, a mug of lukewarm tea in his hands. He wasn't drinking it, he was just holding it for the fading warmth. He looked at the old photograph on the mantel, Martha, smiling in the summer sun, holding a basket of blueberries. "Just me and the wind tonight, Martha," he whispered into the empty room. His voice sounded rusty and used. He was preparing to go to bed, to simply sleep through the fury of the storm, when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. The wind screamed and whistled. This sound was different. It was a dull, rhythmic thump against the heavy oak of his front door. Elias froze. His hand instinctively went to the handle of the fire poker resting by the wood stove. Bears were hibernating, and wolves usually stayed deep in the timber during a storm like this. No human would be foolish enough to be out there. Thump. Scratch. Thump. It was low, desperate. Elias stood up, his knees popping. He walked slowly to the door, listening intently. The wind howled, drowning out everything, but then a lull came, and in that brief moment of quiet, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a cry. Not a human cry, but something high-pitched, guttural, and filled with pain. "Logic says don't open it," Elias muttered to himself. "Logic says keep the heat in." But Elias had never been a man of pure logic, despite his trade. He unlocked the heavy deadbolt. He took a deep breath, braced his shoulder against the wood, and cracked the door open. The force of the wind nearly knocked him backward. Ice crystals stung his face like needles. The temperature was violent, stealing the breath from his lungs instantly. He squinted into the swirling white chaos, looking down. At first, he saw nothing but the accumulating drift of snow. He was about to slam the door shut, convinced it was just a branch banging against the porch, when a patch of snow moved. It wasn't snow. Lying on his doormat, curled into a tight, shivering ball, was a mass of silver and gray fur. It was huge, much larger than a house cat, but too small to be a wolf. The creature lifted its head weakly. Enormous, tufted ears twitched against the gale. 2 eyes, the color of polished amber, locked onto Elias's face. It was a Canada Lynx, the ghost of the forest. Elias stared in shock. These animals were phantoms. In his 20 years living on the mountain, he had only seen tracks, never the cat itself. They were elusive, solitary, and terrified of humans. For one to be on his porch, exposed and vulnerable, meant only one thing. It was dying. The lynx opened its mouth to hiss, but no sound came out. Its head dropped back onto the icy wood with a heavy thud. Elias looked at the swirling snow burying the animal. If he left it there, it would be a frozen statue within an hour. If he brought it in, well, it was a wild predator with claws that could strip the flesh from his arm. He looked back at Martha's photo. He could almost hear her voice. "Don't you dare close that door, Elias." "You foolish old man," he grumbled. He didn't have time to think. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from the coat rack, dropped to his knees in the doorway, and threw it over the animal. The lynx didn't even flinch. It was too far gone. Elias scooped the bundle up. It was surprisingly heavy, dead weight in his arms, essentially a block of ice with a heartbeat. He kicked the door shut with his heel and bolted it, leaning back against the wood to catch his breath. The silence of the cabin returned, but the atmosphere had changed instantly. He wasn't alone anymore. He carried the bundle to the rug in front of the wood stove. He laid it down gently and peeled back the blanket. The lynx was emaciated. Its ribs were visible through the thick winter coat. But what drew Elias's eye was the dark, matted patch of fur on its flank. Fresh blood. It hadn't just collapsed from the cold. It had been injured. A trap? A fight with a wolf? He couldn't tell. The cat was unconscious, its breathing shallow and erratic. Elias went into fix-it mode. He forgot his aching joints. He hurried to the kitchen, grabbed a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. He fetched his first aid kit, the one he kept for chopping wood accidents. He knelt beside the wild creature. Up close, the paws were massive, acting as natural snowshoes, but now they were cold and hard as stone. He began to gently wipe away the ice from the cat's face. "Come on now," Elias whispered, his hands trembling slightly. "You didn't walk all the way to my door just to quit." He checked the wound. It was a deep gash, jagged and ugly. It looked like the work of a misplaced antler tine or a bad fall onto sharp rocks. It needed cleaning, but he dared not stitch it while the animal was awake, and he certainly couldn't do it while it was asleep for fear of waking it into a frenzy. For the next 3 hours, Elias worked with the precision of a watchmaker. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped the torso of the lynx with gauze, moving slowly, constantly watching those amber eyes for any sign of movement. The cat didn't stir. By midnight, the storm had intensified. The cabin shook violently. Elias sat on the floor, his back against the sofa, watching the rise and fall of the lynx's chest. He was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep. He wondered why it had come here. Animals usually found a dark hole to die in. They didn't seek out their enemies. Was it desperation? Or was it something else? Around 2 a.m., the lynx made a sound. A low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Elias stiffened. He pulled his legs back slowly. The lynx's eyes opened. They were groggy, clouded with pain, but sharp. It tried to lift its head, realized it couldn't, and let out a chuff of frustration. It sniffed the air, smelling the wood smoke, the old leather, and the human. Panic flared in the animal's eyes. It thrashed its paws, trying to scramble away, but its claws just scrabbled uselessly against the rug. It was too weak to stand. "Easy," Elias said, his voice low and steady. He held up his hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe." The lynx froze at the sound of his voice. It hissed, baring teeth that were white and dangerously sharp. The sound was like escaping steam. "I know," Elias said softly. "I know you're scared. But you're bleeding, and it's 40 below zero out there. You stay here, you live. You go out there, you die. It's simple math." He didn't know if the animal understood the tone, but the hissing stopped. The cat watched him, unblinking. Elias slowly reached for a piece of dried venison jerky he had placed on the table earlier. He tossed it gently. It landed a foot from the lynx's nose. The cat didn't look at the meat. It kept its eyes on Elias. It was a standoff. Predator and prey, except the roles were confused. Elias leaned his head back against the sofa and closed his eyes, feigning sleep. He knew that maintaining eye contact was a threat. He had to show he was indifferent. Minutes ticked by. Tick. Tock. Then a soft sound. The wet crunch of chewing. Elias didn't move a muscle, but a small smile touched his lips. It was eating. The rest of the night passed in a strange vigil. Every time the fire dimmed, Elias would move slowly to add a log, and the lynx would track his every movement, tense and ready to strike. But it never did. It was too weak, and perhaps, on some instinctual level, it recognized the warmth radiating from the stove was a gift from this strange, tall creature. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the frosted windows, the storm finally broke. The howling wind died down to a whisper. Elias stood up, his body stiff. The lynx was awake, watching him. It looked slightly stronger now. The bleeding had stopped. "Well," Elias said, looking down at the wild cat occupying his living room rug. "I guess I need to give you a name if you're going to eat all my jerky." He looked at the silver fur, shimmering in the pale morning light. "Silas," Elias said. "It means of the forest. Seems fitting." The lynx blinked slowly. Elias turned to go to the kitchen to make coffee, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had a patient. He had a mission. But as he reached for the coffee pot, he glanced out the back window of the cabin. The storm had cleared enough to see the tree line about 50 yards away. Elias dropped the coffee pot. It shattered on the floor, the glass exploding. The noise startled the lynx, causing it to let out a snarl, but Elias didn't hear it. He was staring out the window, his face draining of color. There, emerging from the edge of the dark forest, wasn't just tracks. It was a pack. 5 timber wolves, massive and dark against the snow, were standing at the edge of the clearing. They weren't moving through. They were waiting. They were staring directly at the cabin. They were following a blood trail. Elias looked back at the wounded lynx on his floor, then back at the wolves. He realized with a sinking heart that the danger hadn't passed with the storm. The storm had just delivered something much more dangerous to his doorstep. He had saved the lynx, yes. But in doing so, he had invited a war into his sanctuary. Elias looked at the antique shotgun mounted above the door, a gun he hadn't fired in a decade. "Well, Silas," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "It looks like you brought some friends." The wolves took a synchronized step forward toward the cabin. "Harika, Hakayanan Jerelimani Artereric Devami Dioras. Ilk Belumd Elias, Urali Visaji Silas, Kurtardi Ama Bu Ilik, Daganan Asamazais Berjersagini Kapazina Gaturdi. AC Berkurt Surusu. Ist the Clockmaker's Winter, Hikiezanin 2. Bulumu. Story title, The Clockmaker's Winter. Part 2 of 6. Part 2, The Siege. The shattered glass of the coffee pot lay scattered across the kitchen floor like diamonds, but Elias didn't look down. His gaze was fixed on the tree-line, locked with the dark, unblinking eyes of the pack leader. The alpha wolf was massive, its fur a matted tapestry of charcoal and slate gray. It stood motionless while the others, 4 of them, leaner and restless, paced behind it, their paws sinking deep into the fresh snow. They were close enough that Elias could see the vapor rising from their snouts in the freezing air. They weren't just passing through. They were hunting, and they knew exactly where their prey was. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt out of sync with the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the living room. "They can smell the blood," Elias whispered, the realization settling in his stomach like lead. He stepped back from the window slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. He knew wolves. He knew that showing fear or flight triggered their chase instinct. He reached for the old Winchester rifle hanging above the back door. The metal was cold in his hands, familiar yet foreign. He hadn't fired it in years, not since a rabid coyote had threatened Martha's garden a decade ago. He checked the chamber. Loaded. He moved quickly now, his old joints protesting the sudden activity. He checked the lock on the back door, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place. He moved to the front door, double-checking the deadbolt. Then he went to the windows. They were double-paned, strong against the wind, but against a determined pack of 100-pound predators? He wasn't so sure. In the living room, the atmosphere had shifted. Silas, the injured lynx, was no longer lying flat. He had dragged himself into a sitting position, his back pressed against the stone hearth of the fireplace. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, and a low, guttural growl emanated from deep within his chest. The cat knew. Elias walked over to him, the rifle held loosely in one hand. "You hear them too, don't you?" he asked softly. Silas hissed, swiping a heavy paw at the air, but his eyes weren't on Elias. They were darting toward the window, wide with primal terror. In the wild, wolves were the natural enemy of the lynx. A lone cat against a pack stood zero chance. Silas had sought shelter from the cold, but he had walked into a trap. "I won't let them in," Elias said, his voice firmer this time. He knelt down, keeping a respectful distance. "You came to my house. That makes you a guest. And I don't let guests get eaten." He grabbed a heavy quilt from the sofa and draped it over the bottom half of the low front window, blocking the view. If the cat couldn't see the wolves, maybe he would calm down. It seemed to work. The growling subsided to a nervous rumble. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, whistling through the eaves. But beneath the wind, there were other sounds. The crunch of snow. The scratch of claws on wood. They were testing the perimeter. Elias spent the next hour moving furniture. He pushed a heavy oak dresser in front of the back door. He wedged a chair under the handle of the front door. It was an irrational fear. Wolves couldn't turn doorknobs, but it made him feel like he was doing something. He was fortifying his castle. By noon, the sun was high but offered no warmth. Elias heated up a can of soup on the wood stove, the smell of chicken and broth filling the small space. He poured a little into a saucer and slid it toward Silas. The lynx looked at the food, then at the window, then at Elias. Hunger won out. He lapped at the broth, his rough tongue making a rhythmic scraping sound against the ceramic. "Good," Elias murmured. "Keep your strength up. We might be here a while." He was sipping his own tea when the first real attack came. It wasn't a crash. It was a thud, heavy and deliberate, against the side of the cabin. Then another. Then the sound of tearing wood. Elias grabbed the rifle and ran to the kitchen. The noise was coming from the mudroom, a small, poorly insulated addition where he kept his firewood and boots. The walls there were thinner. He peered through the small window connecting the kitchen to the mudroom. What he saw stopped his breath. 2 of the younger wolves were gnawing at the corner of the mudroom's outer door. The wood was old, weathered by 50 winters, and splinters were flying as powerful jaws worked at the frame. They weren't just biting blindly. They were focused on the gap where the door met the jamb. "Smart," Elias muttered. "Too smart." He unlocked the kitchen door and stepped into the freezing mudroom, raising the rifle. He didn't want to kill them. He respected the balance of the mountain. They were hungry, just like Silas. But this was his home. He aimed the barrel at the ceiling and pulled the trigger. Crack! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Dust fell from the rafters. Through the window, Elias saw the 2 wolves scramble back, yelping in surprise. They retreated to the treeline, tails tucked. Elias exhaled, his shoulders stinging from the recoil. "That's right," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Go find a rabbit. There's nothing here for you." He waited. 5 minutes. 10. The forest was silent again. He returned to the living room, his hands shaking slightly. Silas was pressed flat against the floor, terrified by the noise of the gun. "It's okay," Elias soothed, sitting in his armchair. "I just had to speak their language." But as the afternoon wore on, Elias realized the gunshot had only bought him time. It hadn't bought him safety. As twilight approached, turning the snow a bruised purple, the alpha returned. This time, he didn't stay in the treeline. He walked right up to the porch steps. Elias watched from the window. The wolf was magnificent and terrifying. He looked up at the glass, his yellow eyes boring into Elias's soul. There was no fear in that gaze. Only calculation. The alpha sniffed the air, smelling the blood of the lynx, smelling the fear of the man. Then he sat down. He simply sat there, right on the porch, blocking the exit. It was a siege. They weren't going to waste energy breaking in if they didn't have to. They were going to wait. They knew the man had to come out eventually, or the heat would die, or the fear would break him. Night fell heavy and fast. The temperature dropped to -45. The cabin groaned as the wood contracted in the bitter cold. Elias fed the fire. He had enough wood inside for maybe 2 days. After that, he would have to go to the woodshed. And the woodshed was outside. He looked at Silas. The lynx was sleeping fitfully, twitching in his dreams. The bandage on his flank was holding, but he was still weak. "We're in a bit of a pickle, Silas," Elias whispered. To distract himself, Elias went to his workbench in the corner. Scattered across the surface were the guts of an antique cuckoo clock he had been repairing for a client in the valley. Brass gears, tiny springs, delicate chains. He put on his magnifying loupe and picked up a pair of tweezers. He focused on a tiny escapement mechanism. Fit the gear. Tighten the screw. Check the tension. The mechanical work usually calmed him. It made sense. Cause and effect. But tonight, his hands weren't steady. Every time a board creaked, he jumped. Around midnight, a new sound began. It started low, a mournful wail rising from the darkness, joining the wind. Then another voice joined in, and another. A chorus of howls erupted around the cabin, surrounding them from all sides. It wasn't the chaotic yipping of coyotes. It was the deep, resonant song of the timber wolf. It was a song of ownership. This mountain is ours. This night is ours. Inside the cabin, Silas woke up with a start. He tried to scramble up the curtains, his claws shredding the fabric, panicked by the sound. "Hey! Hey!" Elias dropped his tools and rushed over. He grabbed a pillow to shield himself and tried to corner the terrified cat. "Calm down. You're going to tear your stitches." Silas was hissing, spitting, eyes fully dilated. He backed into the corner, swiping at Elias. A razor-sharp claw caught Elias's hand, slicing across the back of his knuckles. "Ah!" Elias recoiled, clutching his hand. Blood welled up, bright red. He looked at the cat. Silas was trembling violently, pressing himself into the corner as if trying to merge with the wall. The howling outside was relentless, vibrating through the walls. Elias ignored his bleeding hand. He saw the terror in the animal's eyes and recognized it. It was the same terror he felt when Martha died, the feeling of being small and alone against a universe that didn't care. He sat down on the floor, ignoring the hiss. He began to hum. It was an old lullaby Martha used to hum. He hummed louder, trying to drown out the wolves. "Hush now, don't you cry." Slowly, the howling outside faded into an eerie silence. Inside, the humming continued. Silas stopped hissing. He watched Elias. The scent of Elias's blood was in the air, mixing with the scent of the lynx's blood. Elias extended his uninjured hand, palm up, resting it on his knee. He didn't move it closer. He just offered it. "I'm not leaving you," Elias said softly. "And I'm not letting them take you." For a long time, nothing happened. Then, tentatively, Silas stretched his neck forward. He sniffed Elias's fingers. He smelled the blood, the oil from the clock gears, and the soap. Then the great cat did something impossible. He rubbed his cheek against Elias's hand. Just once. A fleeting touch of soft fur against rough skin. It was a truce. A pact. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. But the moment of peace was shattered instantly. Crash. The sound of shattering glass came from the bedroom at the back of the house. Elias scrambled to his feet, grabbing the rifle. The cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying a swirl of snow. He ran to the bedroom doorway and froze. The upper pane of the window was broken. A large branch, driven by the wind? No. Standing on the snowbank outside, framed by the jagged glass, was one of the wolves. It had leaped, testing the glass, and broken through. It was trying to scramble up the sill, its paws scrabbling for purchase on the window frame. Elias raised the rifle, but his hands were shaking. The wolf snarled, snapping its jaws at him, trying to pull its bulk through the opening. If it got in, the others would follow. The breach had been made. "Get back!" Elias screamed. He didn't shoot. He couldn't risk missing and hitting the wall or the window frame. Instead, he grabbed the heavy iron lamp from the bedside table and swung it with all the strength of his 72 years. The base of the lamp connected with the wolf's snout with a sickening crunch. The wolf yelped, lost its grip, and fell backward into the snow. Elias rushed forward, ignoring the razor-sharp cold, and shoved the heavy oak wardrobe in front of the window. He pushed until his muscles screamed, wedging it tight against the broken glass. He collapsed against the wardrobe, gasping for air. The wind whistled through the gaps, freezing the sweat on his forehead. They had found a way in. He limped back to the living room. Silas was standing in the center of the room, looking at the bedroom door, his body low to the ground. Elias looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. He looked at his bleeding hand, then at the rifle, then at the lynx. "They're not waiting anymore, Silas," Elias said, his voice grim. "The siege is over. The assault has begun." And as if to answer him, the power lines outside gave way under the weight of the ice. The cabin plunged into absolute darkness. The only light remaining was the dying orange glow of the embers in the wood stove, and the two golden eyes of the lynx glowing in the dark. Darkness didn't just fall, it crashed down on them. When the power grid failed, the cabin was plunged into a heavy, suffocating blackness, broken only by the angry orange glow of the wood stove's embers and the faint, ghostly blue light of the snow reflecting through the windows. Elias stood frozen in the center of the room. The silence was absolute, save for the wind. The hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the electric heater, all the modern sounds that masked the reality of his isolation, were gone. Now, there was only the breathing of an old man and a wounded lynx. He fumbled in the dark, his hands brushing against the workbench until he found what he needed, a heavy brass kerosene lamp. He struck a match. The flame flared, casting long, dancing shadows that made the mounted deer heads on the wall look like they were twisting in agony. "Step 1, light," Elias whispered, his breath visible in the cooling air. "Step 2, fortify." He looked at Silas. The lynx hadn't moved. The cat was crouched low, his amber eyes dilated into black saucers, staring intently at the floorboards near the kitchen. His ears swiveled like radar dishes, picking up sounds Elias couldn't hear. Scritch. Scritch. Now Elias heard it too. A dry, rasping sound coming from beneath the cabin. The wolves weren't just at the doors anymore. They were under the house, in the crawl space, testing the floorboards for weakness. The realization made Elias's skin crawl. "They're probing," Elias muttered. looking for a soft spot. He couldn't guard every wall, every window, and the floor all at once. He was one old man with a single-shot rifle and shaky hands. He needed eyes in the back of his head. He needed a system. Elias turned to his workbench, his eyes landing on the guts of the dismantled cuckoo clocks and the massive grandfather clock in the corner. He wasn't a soldier. He was a clockmaker. He understood tension, triggers, and alarms. "All right, Silas," he said, grabbing a spool of strong copper wire and a handful of brass bells he used for chime repairs. "Let's build a mousetrap." For the next hour, Elias worked with a feverish intensity. He tied the copper wire across the potential entry points: the mudroom door, the boarded-up bedroom window, and the main entrance. He strung the wires tight, running them along the ceiling beams like a spiderweb, converging them all to a single point above the mantel. There, he rigged a cluster of heavy brass chimes. If any of the tripwires were disturbed, if a door was pushed even an inch or a board pried loose, the tension would release the striker, and the chimes would crash down. It was a primitive alarm system, but it was all he had. As he worked, the temperature in the cabin began to plummet. Without the electric baseboard heaters, the wood stove was fighting a losing battle against the -40-degree night. Frost began to creep up the inside of the window panes, creating intricate, deadly patterns. Elias threw 2 more logs into the stove. He looked into the wood box. It was nearly empty. Maybe 5 logs left. 6 hours of heat, max. "Don't think about that yet," he scolded himself. He sat down in his armchair, the rifle across his lap, the kerosene lamp turned low to save fuel. Silas dragged himself closer to the stove, his shivering returning. The painkiller Elias had crushed into the broth earlier was wearing off. "Come here," Elias gestured. Surprisingly, the lynx obeyed. He didn't come within touching distance, but he lay parallel to Elias's chair, their backs guarding each other. Time stretched. Tick-tock went the grandfather clock, driven by gravity, indifferent to the power outage. Around 4 a.m., the alarm triggered. Clang, clang, clang. The brass chimes smashed together, the sound piercing the silence like a scream. Elias jumped up, heart pounding. The wire leading to the kitchen window was vibrating violently. He grabbed the rifle and the lamp, rushing to the kitchen. The window wasn't broken, but the frame was groaning. Outside, in the flickering halo of the lamp, he saw a dark shape rearing up, paws slamming against the glass. The wolf was massive, throwing its full weight against the pane. Thud. Crack. A spiderweb fracture appeared in the center of the glass. "Get back!" Elias roared. He couldn't shoot through the glass. It would shatter the barrier and let the cold, and the pack, in. He needed a deterrent. He looked around wildly. On the counter sat a bottle of ammonia and a bottle of bleach he used for deep cleaning. Chemistry, he thought. He grabbed a rag and the bottle of ammonia. He cracked the window open just a hair, risky, dangerous. The wolf snarled, shoving its snout into the gap, teeth snapping inches from Elias's fingers. Elias splashed the ammonia onto the rag and shoved it right into the wolf's sensitive nose. The reaction was instant. The wolf yelped, a high-pitched sound of pain as the chemical burned its heightened olfactory senses. It fell back, sneezing and thrashing in the snow, rubbing its snout against the ice. Elias slammed the window shut and locked it, his heart racing at a dangerous speed. He leaned against the counter, gasping. "One down," he wheezed. He returned to the living room, legs shaking. But the victory was short-lived. Silas was standing now, his back arched, hissing at the front door. The doorknob was turning. It rattled back and forth, metal grinding on metal. Wolves couldn't turn knobs unless they learned. Unless they watched. Or maybe they were just clawing at it, and the friction was turning it. Then came the impact. Boom. The whole cabin shook. The Alpha. It had to be the Alpha. He was throwing his 150-pound body against the main door. Boom. The wood splintered around the deadbolt. The screws holding the lock plate were old. They wouldn't hold forever. Elias looked at the heavy grandfather clock. It was solid oak, 7 feet tall, weighing nearly 200 pounds. "I'm sorry, Martha," he whispered. "I have to move it." He dropped the rifle and put his shoulder against the side of the clock. He pushed. It didn't budge. Boom. The door groaned. A crack of light appeared at the jamb. "Silas!" Elias yelled, though he knew the cat couldn't help. "Push!" He dug his heels into the rug. He gritted his teeth, channeling every ounce of adrenaline, every bit of fear, every year of hard labor he had left in his body. He shoved. The clock scraped across the floor with a screech. Inch by inch. Boom. The door latch snapped. The door swung open a few inches, held only by the security chain. A black snout pushed through the gap, teeth bared, snarling. Elias screamed, a primal sound, and gave one final, desperate shove. The grandfather clock slid into place, slamming against the door, pinning it shut. The wolf's snout was caught for a split second before it yanked back with a yelp of pain. The heavy oak clock acted as a barricade, sealing the entrance. Elias collapsed to the floor, his chest heaving, his vision spotting. He checked the time on the clock face, now crooked and silent. The pendulum had stopped swinging during the move. Time had stopped. He looked over at the wood stove. The fire had burned down to glowing red coals. The room was freezing. He could see his breath in thick clouds. He crawled over to the wood box. He reached inside. His hand touched the bottom. Dust. Bark chips. There was one log left. Just one. Elias looked at the log, then at the frozen window, then at the barricaded door. It was 5 a.m. Sunrise was still 3 hours away. That one log would. Anlet him. Hikaya uzatmadan, tum jerelimi vi duagusal kozalmai isran, Veruca ber final balamwile, Part 4, Sonlanderiras. Bubalumd Elias in Odenluck isen yaptiji telekeli hamel. Silas in fetakarlogy v hikayanin duagusal vetasai year allier. Ist the Clockmaker's Winter, Hikiezen in final bulm. Story title, The Clockmaker's Winter. Part 4 of 6 final. Part 4, The Thaw. The last ember in the stove blinked out like a dying star. The cabin was now legally a freezer. Elias could feel the cold settling into his marrow, stiffening his fingers, slowing his heart. He looked at the empty wood box, then at the back door. The woodshed was 20 feet away. It might as well have been the moon. It's time, Elias whispered to the darkness. He prepared for war. He wrapped thick magazines around his forearms, securing them with duct tape, poor man's armor against snapping jaws. He pulled on his heavy parka, checked the single round in his rifle, and grabbed a hunting knife for his belt. Silas, sensing the shift, let out a low, warning growl. The lynx tried to stand, but Elias gently pushed him back. No, Elias said firmly. You stay. You hold the fort. Elias took a deep breath, unbarred the back door, and shoved it open. The wind hit him like a physical blow. He stepped out into the swirling white chaos. The snow was waist deep. He waded forward, rifle held high. 1 step. 2 steps. He reached the woodshed. His hand grasped the icy handle of the door. He was there. He was going to make it. Then, the snowdrift to his left exploded. The alpha didn't growl, he simply struck. 150 pounds of muscle slammed into Elias's side. The rifle flew from his hands, disappearing into the snow. Elias hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs. He rolled onto his back just as the massive wolf lunged for his throat. Elias threw up his arms. The wolf's jaws clamped down on his forearm, teeth tearing through the parka and the layers of taped magazines. The pressure was crushing, bone-bruising, but the armor held. Elias screamed, fumbling for the knife at his belt with his free hand. But his fingers were numb, useless blocks of ice. The alpha shook him violently, dragging him away from the shed. 2 other wolves emerged from the shadows, circling, waiting for their turn to tear him apart. Elias stared up into the yellow eyes of the beast. So this is it, he thought. This is how the clock stops. Suddenly, a blur of silver and fury launched from the open cabin door. Silas. The injured lynx hit the alpha's flank like a cannonball. He was half the wolf's size, weakened and wounded, but he was a ball of razor blades and pure rage. Silas sank his claws into the wolf's neck, screeching a sound that tore through the storm. The alpha yelped in surprise, releasing Elias to snap at the creature clinging to his back. Silas was thrown off, tumbling into the snow, his stitches surely tearing, blood staining the white powder. But that split second was all Elias needed. Adrenaline flooded his system, hotter than any fire. He scrambled on his hands and knees, diving for the spot where his rifle had fallen. His fingers brushed cold steel. He rolled over, cocking the lever action in one smooth motion. The alpha had pinned Silas now, jaws opening to crush the cat's skull. Hey! Elias roared. The wolf looked up. Boom. The shot echoed through the valley. Elias didn't aim to kill. His hands were shaking too much. He aimed for the ground right between the alpha's front paws. The bullet struck the ice, spraying razor-sharp shards into the wolf's face and chest. Stung, blinded, and shocked by the thunderous noise, the alpha flinched. The pack instinct broke. The leader was hurt. The prey was fighting back. The element of surprise was gone. The alpha turned and ran, a dark streak disappearing into the treeline. The other wolves, seeing their leader flee, hesitated for a second, then turned and vanished into the storm. Silence returned to the mountain. Elias didn't wait. He grabbed Silas, who was lying motionless in the snow, and dragged him back into the cabin. He went back out one more time, adrenaline fading, and dragged a sled full of logs inside. He slammed the door, bolted it, and collapsed. The thaw came 2 months later. The mountains wept melting snow, creating rivers that sang of spring. The valley turned a brilliant, impossible green. Elias sat on his porch, a mug of coffee in his hand. His arm was still stiff, a jagged scar running down his forearm, but it worked. The cabin was warm. The grandfather clock was ticking again, tick-tock, tick-tock, a steady, reassuring heartbeat. Beside him sat Silas. The lynx had healed. His coat was thick and glossy, his movements fluid and powerful. He wasn't a pet. He never purred, never played. But he stayed. He had slept at the foot of Elias's bed every night through the rest of the winter. But today, Silas was restless. He paced the length of the porch, looking toward the forest. The air smelled of pine and prey. Elias knew. He had known this day would come since the first robin appeared. "Go on, then," Elias said softly, not looking at the cat. "The door is open." Silas stopped pacing. He looked at Elias with those ancient amber eyes. There was no sentimentality in them, only a deep, profound recognition. Two survivors who had kept each other's clocks ticking for one more season. The lynx stepped off the porch. He walked to the edge of the clearing, where the tall grass met the trees. He stopped. He turned back. For a long moment, man and beast held each other's gaze. A silent language passed between them. A thank you, a goodbye, a promise remembered. Then, Silas turned and melted into the shadows of the forest, as if he had never been there at all. Elias sat on the porch for a long time as the sun dipped below the peaks. He took a sip of his coffee. He looked at the empty spot where the cat had stood. He was alone again. But as he listened to the wind in the trees and the ticking of his clocks, Elias realized something had changed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. The house wasn't empty. It was just quiet. He had opened his door to the winter, and instead of death, life had walked in. "Have a good life, Silas," Elias whispered. He stood up, picked up his toolkit, and went back inside. There were clocks to fix, and for the first time in years, Elias felt like he had all the time in the world. Last maybe 40 minutes. After that, the cold would kill them long before the wolves did. The woodshed was 20 feet from the back door. It might as well have been 20 miles. Elias looked at Silas. The lynx was watching him, shivering violently now. "Well, partner," Elias whispered, tossing the final log into the fire. "We survived the night. But now we have to survive the morning."